Hand over the keys, Clara. That house belongs to us now. The words struck harder than the slap that followed. My cheek burned, my glasses shattered across polished marble, and 100 guests stared as though I were the intruder at my own son's wedding. The orchestra faltered, the laughter died, and all that remained was silence. Thick, merciless silence. I am Clara Bennett, 47 years old. At 20, I married the only man I ever loved. At 24, I buried him. From that moment, I raised our son alone. No partner, no family fortune, just long shifts and sleepless nights. I worked anywhere that would take me, waitressing at dawn, cleaning offices after dark, arranging flowers in between because the florist paid in cash. There were winters I skipped meals so Ethan could eat. Summers I wore thrift store shoes until the soles gave out so he could have cleats for soccer. I patched school uniforms under a dim lamp while listening to him breathe softly in the next room, praying he would never feel how empty my hands were. Every wrinkle on my face, every callus on my palms was carved from sacrifice. And yet, in this ballroom, dressed in hand-me-down satin, I was nothing more than a target of ridicule. Juliet's voice sliced through the silence. "You don't need that house, Clara. You've had your time. Ethan and I deserve it now." She spoke as though I were a tenant, overstaying a lease, not the woman who had built her entire life around protecting that home for her son. I turned toward Ethan, my only child, the reason I had endured 27 years of grief and grit. He did not move. He did not speak. His head hung low, shoulders stiff, as though loyalty to his wife required silence against his mother. A hollowness spread inside me, heavier than the sting of the slap. I bent to gather the glass scattered at my feet. My hands trembled, cut by tiny shards, yet no one offered to help. Some guests whispered, others averted their gaze. Their pity was suffocating, as if I were a fragile relic about to crumble. But I am not fragile. Not after bearing a husband before I'd learned how to be a wife. Not after years of working 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Not after raising a boy into a man with nothing but grit and love. That slap didn't break me. It ignited me. The humiliation was real, but so was the fire rising in my chest. I walked out of the ballroom, each step steadier than the last. In the night air, my breath steadied. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The number I dialed was one I had memorized long ago, but sworn never to use. When Carlos answered, my voice no longer trembled. "It's Clara. Bring the documents to the ballroom. Tonight they'll learn exactly who I am and what I've endured to stand here." The night air clung cold against my skin as I ended the call with Carlos. For a moment, I simply stood by my car, the weight of the ballroom's silence still pressing down on me. The sting of the slap had faded, but another ache spread deeper, the ache of years that had led me here. As I leaned against the car door, my mind slipped backward, pulling me into the first day Juliet Dawson crossed my threshold. It was 2 years ago, late autumn. Ethan had knocked on my apartment door with the same boyish grin he'd worn since grade school. "Mom, there's someone I want you to meet," he'd said, eyes sparkling with a mixture of nerves and pride. Juliet appeared in the doorway like she had stepped straight out of a glossy magazine. Her hair gleamed under the hallway light, her perfume lingered in the air, and the first thing she did was scan my apartment with a faint curl of her lip. The couch I'd bought secondhand, the chipped coffee table, the outdated wallpaper, her eyes cataloged it all. "So this is home," she murmured, her tone polite but laced with disdain. Ethan, blinded by affection, didn't notice, but I did. A mother always notices. I served dinner that night, roast chicken, potatoes, a recipe I'd stretched 100 times when money was thin. Juliet barely touched it. She picked at her plate with manicured nails, offering only, "I'm careful with what I eat." When I asked about her family, she deflected, but when the conversation turned toward my life, her curiosity sharpened. "How do you manage on a widow's pension, Clara?" It must be hard. The question seemed innocent, yet her eyes lingered with calculation. In the weeks that followed, her visits became more frequent, and so did the subtle jabs. "That car of yours is ancient. It must be dangerous by now. Or, Clara, women your age shouldn't have to work at flower shops. Isn't it exhausting? Each phrase dripped with condescension, disguised as concern. I told myself to be patient. Ethan was happy, and that mattered more than my pride. But slowly, I began to see the strings tightening around him. Juliet's opinions became his. Where he once laughed at my thrift store bargains, he now frowned and echoed her voice. "Mom, maybe you should move somewhere smaller. It's safer." The first real crack came during a family dinner 3 months before their engagement. Juliet leaned across the table, her smile polished. "Clara, don't you think it's time you downsized? A 2-bedroom apartment is far too much for one person. Ethan and I will be thinking about children soon. We'll need more space." I forced a smile, my fork trembling in my hand. Ethan nodded beside her, silent but complicit. That night, when I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself if I had already lost him. The pressure only grew. Juliet began bringing real estate brochures, laying them on my coffee table as if she were doing me a favor. "These senior communities have wonderful amenities, meals, activities, medical support. You'd be so much happier there." Her voice was velvet, but her eyes always drifted toward my balcony view, the location she coveted more than my well-being. I wanted to believe she cared, that perhaps I was misreading her intentions. But the illusion cracked the day I overheard her whispering in my kitchen while Ethan stepped into the bathroom. "Yes, Mom, the apartment is perfect. If I can convince her to move, we'll live there until we buy our own place. She's so naive, she'll probably thank us for helping her." The words struck like ice water. I stood in the hallway, invisible, while she planned my displacement as casually as ordering flowers. When Ethan returned, she smiled at me sweetly, as if nothing had passed her lips. From that day, I began watching more closely. Her compliments turned into subtle digs, her advice into veiled commands. And Ethan, my Ethan, absorbed it all. Where once he defended me fiercely, now he repeated her lines with mechanical precision. I told myself it was a phase, that love had clouded his judgment. But as their engagement approached, Juliet's manipulation grew bolder. She began hinting not only at my home, but at my finances. "Clara, surely you've saved something for Ethan's future." Parents always do. Her words were sugar, but her meaning was acid. That was when I reached out to Carlos, my late husband's trusted friend and advisor. I asked him to investigate quietly. When the reports came back, they painted a chilling picture. Debts piling high, luxury cars financed on credit, wedding expenses drowning them both. Their life was a stage set, and my apartment was the lifeline behind the curtain. Standing outside the ballroom now, replaying those moments, I understood the full cruelty of it. Juliet's slap wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable climax of a plot she had been weaving from the start. And Ethan, the boy I had raised through hunger and grief, had let himself become her accomplice. I tightened my grip on the phone in my hand. Tonight, their stage would collapse, and I would no longer play the part of the helpless widow. The memory of Juliet's whispered phone call still rang in my head when the ballroom door swung open again. I stepped back inside, my cheeks still stinging from her earlier assault, my heart weighed down by the knowledge of every humiliation I had endured in silence. The chandeliers blazed above me as if mocking my return, their glitter too sharp, too bright for the shadows building inside me. Juliet's laughter sliced through the crowd before she saw me. She was surrounded by her friends, their faces glowing with champagne and celebration. When her eyes met mine, her smile twisted, triumphant and venomous. "Still here," she sneered loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Don't embarrass yourself further, Clara. Just hand over the keys and go." A hush fell once more. 100 pairs of eyes turned on me, and I felt their judgment pressing down like heavy stones. I had been invisible most of my life, blending into thrift stores and flower shops, but never had invisibility felt this cruel. I was not unseen. I was scrutinized, reduced to a spectacle. My son stood only steps away, his bow tie askew, his face pale. Ethan's lips parted as if he might speak, but no words came. Not a defense, not even a whisper. He looked at me with a mixture of shame and hesitation, as though his mother's dignity were a debt he couldn't afford to pay. I wanted to scream at him, to remind him of nights I had gone hungry so he could eat, of mornings I'd walked to work through snowstorms so he could have bus fare, but the words stuck in my throat. For all my sacrifices, all my love, I realized in that moment my son was not on my side. Juliet took another step closer, her veil shimmering under the lights. She reached out and shoved my shoulder with her perfectly manicured hand. You don't belong here anymore. This is our life now, your space, your home. It's ours. Her voice rose with each sentence, daring anyone to stop her. But no one did. Guests whispered, shifted in their chairs. Some pulled out their phones as if the humiliation of a middle-aged widow was entertainment worth capturing. My knees weakened. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me, and yet beneath the ache of betrayal, something else surged, a heat sharp and steady. It wasn't anger alone, it was clarity. I bent to gather the shards of my glasses again, though my vision blurred without them. Each fragment cut into my palm, tiny needles of pain anchoring me to the present. I felt tears spill, not because of fear, but because the line had finally been crossed. I straightened slowly, forcing myself to meet Juliet's stare. My voice, though quiet, carried across the ballroom. This is not your home, and you will regret the day you thought it could be. For the first time that night, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The silence that followed was unbearable, yet also liberating. The people around us leaned in, eager to see what would come next. And it was in that silence that I realized something important. Not just for me, but for anyone who has ever felt cornered, humiliated, discarded. Have you ever stood alone in a room full of people, humiliated by the very ones who should have loved you most? That feeling, the sting of betrayal in front of a crowd, is something you don't forget. If you've ever been there, share your story in the comments, because none of us should endure that kind of silence alone. And if you want to know how this night unfolded, stay with me. What comes next will shock you more than this slap. I drew in a long breath, steadying myself. My phone buzzed softly in my purse. Carlos had arrived. Relief mixed with determination. Tonight, I would no longer wear the mask of weakness. I slipped toward the exit again, ignoring Juliet's mocking laughter. Outside, Carlos stood by his car, a leather folder tucked under his arm. His expression was grave, but his eyes softened when he saw my trembling hands. Are you sure about this, Clara? Once we begin, there's no turning back. I nodded, the bruised side of my face throbbing with every heartbeat. I've been sure since the moment she touched me. Tonight, the truth won't hide any longer. He opened the folder beneath the glow of the streetlights. Papers rustled, a will, bank statements, deeds, transfers. Proof that the life Juliet mocked as pathetic had been deliberately crafted, a disguise to shield my family from greed. Proof that the woman she called useless had been the one quietly keeping her and Ethan afloat. As Carlos spoke, outlining the steps, I listened with a strange calm. For years I lived in shadows, protecting a son who no longer protected me. Tonight, under the gaze of chandeliers and gossiping strangers, the shadows would fall away. I looked back at the ballroom windows. The music had resumed inside, laughter echoing as though nothing had happened. But the celebration would not last. Within minutes, their perfect stage would collapse, and the audience who had witnessed my humiliation would witness something far greater, the truth. I tightened my grip on the folder Carlos handed me. No longer a victim, no longer invisible, I turned back toward the door, ready to reclaim the dignity they thought they had destroyed. The weight of the folder in my hands was heavier than stone, but it steadied me. Every document inside was a blade of truth, forged over decades of sacrifice. Carlos adjusted his tie and gave me a small nod, the kind of reassurance only someone who had walked through fire with you could give. "Ready and?" he asked quietly. I looked back at the ballroom's golden doors, where music and laughter still poured out as though nothing had happened. "More than ever," I said, and together we stepped inside. The room fell silent the instant we appeared. Conversations stuttered to a halt. Violins screeched off key. Champagne glasses froze midair. Dozens of faces turned, confusion mingling with curiosity. Some guests leaned forward in their chairs, already sensing that the night was about to turn into something unforgettable. Juliet was the first to recover. She spun toward me, her veil swishing, anger sharp in her eyes. "What are you doing back here, Clara? Haven't you embarrassed yourself enough?" Her voice carried across the hall, brittle but loud. I didn't answer. Instead, Carlos stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice firm, professional. "I apologize for interrupting this celebration, but urgent matters must be addressed with Mr. Ethan Hughes and Mrs. Juliet Dawson." The silence deepened, thick enough to choke on. A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd. Phones appeared in hands again, eager to record. Ethan stumbled a step forward, his eyes darting between me and Carlos. "Mom, what's happening? Who is this?" His voice wavered, stripped of the confidence he'd shown earlier when he stood by as Juliet struck me. "This," I said, my voice stronger than it had sounded in years, "is the man who knows the truth you've both tried so hard to bury." Carlos opened the folder with deliberate precision, as if every motion were a blade cutting through lies. He pulled out the first document. "Mr. Ethan Hughes, the financial guarantee your mother has provided for your lease has been revoked. Effective immediately, you have 30 days to secure another guarantor or vacate the property." A gasp rippled across the hall. Ethan's face drained of color. "Financial guarantee?" he whispered. "Mom, what is he talking about?" But Carlos continued relentlessly, his tone a hammer striking nail after nail. "Additionally, the monthly transfers of $4,500 into your accounts, covering credit cards, car insurance, and other expenses, are permanently suspended." Juliet let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "That's impossible. She works at a flower shop, for God's sake. Look at her clothes, her car. She doesn't have money. She's lying." Her voice cracked, hysteria bleeding through the arrogance. The guests leaned closer, some whispering, others recording every second. Carlos pulled out another paper. "Finally, the guarantee covering this very celebration, the ballroom, the music, the flowers, the photography, has been canceled. Payment must be rendered in full before guests can leave tonight." The words landed like thunder. A wave of unease swept through the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, clutching their purses and jackets. The glittering celebration teetered on the edge of collapse. Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a drowning man gasping for air. He stared at me, horror dawning in his eyes. You've been paying for everything? All this time?" I met his gaze, my chest tight with both sorrow and steel. "For 3 years, Ethan. I kept you afloat while you believed I was nothing but a burden. Every rent payment, every credit card bill, every luxury you paraded, paid with the hands you allowed your wife to slap tonight." A collective murmur surged through the guests, heads turned, eyes wide. For the first time, pity had shifted, away from me, toward the pale, trembling bride and groom. Juliet staggered forward, clutching her veil. "No, this can't be real. She's nothing. She's a nobody. You can't have lived like a pauper if you had money." Her voice rose to a shriek, desperation cracking her polished facade. I stepped closer, my voice low but clear. "Appearances deceive, Juliet. My husband and I chose modesty to protect our family. We lived simply so that greed would never find us. It seems we were right. The danger came not from strangers, but from within. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning." Juliet's parents shifted uncomfortably at the head table. Realizing their perfect plan was unraveling before 100 witnesses, Carlos pulled the final document from his folder. "And there is one last matter. Mrs. Bennett has amended her will. Effective immediately, all assets once designated for Ethan Hughes are redirected to charitable foundations supporting victims of elder abuse." The words exploded across the room without sound, like lightning splitting a tree. Juliet's knees buckled. She dropped into a chair, her veil askew, her face pale with shock. Ethan swayed on his feet, eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do this," Juliet screamed suddenly, voice breaking. "We're your family. Ethan is your only son. You can't disinherit him over one fight." "A fight?" My voice sharpened, slicing through her hysteria. "You conspired to strip me of my home. You humiliated me in front of every soul here. My own son plotted to declare me incompetent so you could seize everything I built. Do you dare call that a fight?" The words rang like church bells in the silence. Several guests nodded, remembering the slap, the cruel words, the cold silence of Ethan as he watched me break. Some even held up their phones, capturing the moment truth burned lies to ash. Ethan's lips trembled. He took a step toward me, his voice hoarse. "Mom, please. There has to be a way to fix this. Don't do this to us." I looked at him, my boy, my only child. And for a fleeting second, I saw the toddler who once clung to my hand, the teenager who once promised to take care of me someday. But the man standing before me was a stranger, hollowed out by greed. "The only way to fix this," I said softly, was not to break it in the first place." The ballroom exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. Juliet sat slumped, her hands clutching her head. Ethan's shoulders sagged under the weight of what he had lost, not just money, not just security, but his mother's trust. Carlos closed the folder with a decisive snap. "All documents have been delivered. The legal effects begin immediately. The celebration was over. What remained was a reckoning. And for the first time in years, I walked away, not as the widow they pitied, but as the woman they would never forget." The ballroom still buzzed with whispers when Carlos snapped the folder shut. I could feel the air thick with curiosity and unease, like everyone was waiting for the next blow to fall. My chest rose and fell steadily, the calm of a storm that had already unleashed its fury. Juliet sat collapsed in her chair, veil torn, mascara bleeding down her cheeks. For the first time that night, she looked less like a bride and more like a child caught stealing. But even broken, she had venom left. She grasped Ethan's hand, squeezing it hard, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't you see?" she hissed, loud enough for me to hear. "If we don't act, she'll take everything. You'll be left with nothing." Ethan flinched, his face a war of emotions, shame, anger, desperation. He looked at me with eyes that once sought comfort, now filled with blame. "Why, Mom? Why would you do this? You've ruined everything. My wedding, my future, our family." The words struck harder than Juliet's slap. My lips parted, but no sound came. For years, I had imagined my son standing beside me, defending me, cherishing the sacrifices that built his life. Instead, he now stood as my accuser. Carlos tried to intervene. "Mr. Hughes, your mother has acted within every legal right." But Ethan cut him off, voice trembling with fury. "Legal? You think this is about legal? She's not in her right mind. She's vindictive. She doesn't know what she's doing." The guests gasped, the whispers rising again. Juliet seized the opening, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "Exactly. She's unstable. Everyone saw it tonight. Her outburst, her cruelty. We'll prove she's incompetent. We'll take this to court." The words struck me like icy water, my son, my flesh and blood, nodding slowly beside her. His silence no longer passive, it was agreement. His betrayal was no longer silence, it was a choice. I felt the floor tilt beneath me again, but this time I steadied myself. My hand tightened on the folder Carlos had given me, my knuckles white. The fire that had carried me this far did not flicker, it roared. I looked directly at Ethan, my voice low but unshaking. "Incompetent? You think the woman who raised you alone, who fed you when she went hungry, who kept you alive with nothing but her hands, is incompetent?" His lips quivered, but he didn't look away. Juliet's grip on his hand was iron, and he let himself be tethered. The crowd around us shifted uncomfortably. Some guests frowned, disgust plain on their faces. Others shook their heads, unable to believe what they were hearing. The story of betrayal had grown darker, uglier, unfolding in real time before their eyes. I drew a slow breath, letting the silence settle. "This," I said, sweeping my gaze across the room, "is the second betrayal. The first came from her hand on my cheek, the second from my own son's silence, and now his words. Ethan's eyes widened, as if realizing the weight of what he had just aligned himself with. But it was too late. Carlos placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Clara, let's go. You've said what needed to be said. Their choices will echo far louder than your words." I nodded, the ache in my chest sharp but steady. As I turned toward the exit, the whispers swelled into a roar. Some guests applauded softly, others simply stared, their expressions caught between pity and awe. Behind me, Juliet's shrill voice rose again, threatening lawyers, judges, battles yet to come. But I no longer needed to listen. I had heard enough. The night was no longer about a wedding. It had become a reckoning. And though my son had chosen the other side, I knew in my heart this was not my defeat. This was the beginning of their fall. The doors of the ballroom closed behind me with a heavy thud, shutting out Juliet's shrill threats and Ethan's silence. The night air wrapped around me, cold yet cleansing, as though the universe itself was washing away the humiliation I had endured inside. For the first time in years, I did not feel small. I did not feel invisible. I felt free. Carlos walked beside me, his briefcase tucked under his arm, his expression grave but respectful. "You did the right thing, Clara," he said softly. I nodded, though my throat tightened. Doing the right thing rarely feels easy, especially when it means severing the bond you once believed unbreakable. As I reached my car, I paused. Through the ballroom's tall windows, I could still see the chandeliers burning, the guests whispering, the bride and groom unraveling. For decades, I had carried them on my shoulders. Ethan, his dreams, even Juliet without her knowing. And tonight, I finally put that weight down. The ache in my heart would not vanish overnight. Betrayal leaves scars deeper than time. But scars also remind us we survived. I looked up at the night sky, 1,000 stars watching silently, and whispered to myself, this is not the end. This is the beginning of dignity. And maybe you, listening now, know that feeling too. Maybe you've been betrayed by someone you trusted most. Maybe you've been humiliated when you least deserved it. If so, tell me in the comments. Your story matters. And if you want to walk alongside me in more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. It's a small gesture, but it means this voice, our voice, keeps reaching those who need to hear it. Because the truth is this, kindness is not weakness. Sacrifice should never be mistaken for surrender. And family, true family, is not measured by blood, but by respect, loyalty, and love. Juliet thought she could take everything I owned. Ethan thought he could silence me with his absence. But what they both forgot is that dignity cannot be stolen. It can only be surrendered. And I will never surrender mine again. As Carlos opened the car door for me, I drew one last steady breath. The night had torn me apart, yes, but it had also rebuilt me. Stronger, clearer, unafraid. And for every person watching, I hope you remember this. You are never too old, too tired, or too broken to stand up for yourself. Even if it means standing alone, you are still standing. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. I stepped into the car, leaving the ballroom behind me, and with it the life where I had allowed myself to be underestimated. Ahead lay a new chapter, one I would write not with shame, but with strength.